On the morning of September 3rd, 1191, as the sun climbed over the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, two of the greatest military minds of the medieval world prepared to collide. Yet the battle that would enter legend, the 17-minute storm at Arsuf, did not begin with the clash of steel. It began with silence, heat, exhaustion, and a march that felt more like a death sentence than a path to victory. Before the famed cavalry charge shattered Saladin's confidence and rewrote the psychology of holy war, there were 7 days of torment, discipline, and slow, grinding attrition. 7 days in which 12,000 crusaders, battered and suffocating in their own armor, became the living weapon that Richard the Lionheart needed them to be. To understand Arsuf, we must return to that first day, when the last echoes of the siege of Acre had barely faded. The Crusaders had taken the city after 2 years of misery, starvation, and disease, but victory brought no rest. Richard knew that Saladin, the man who had retaken Jerusalem, the man whose name carried the weight of a continent, was waiting just beyond the horizon. The English king faced a brutal choice: march inland toward Jerusalem immediately, or secure the coast first. He chose the latter, a decision that historians would debate for centuries. And yet, as his men began the trek south toward Jaffa, Richard's true plan, quiet and ruthless, was already taking shape. The coastal roads seemed safe. The sea on one side, supply ships following closely, and miles of open terrain that offered no place for a surprise ambush. But the safety was an illusion, and both men knew it. Saladin had scouted this landscape for years. The hills and forests on the eastern side concealed tens of thousands of horsemen. Mamluks, Bedouin, Turkish archers, each trained in the art of harassing fire and sudden disappearance. It was the perfect terrain for Saladin's greatest strength: mobility. Richard, however, was wagering everything on a weapon far less glamorous, far less celebrated, yet infinitely more deadly: discipline. At dawn, the Crusader column began to move. Hospitallers at the front, the royal standard at the center with Richard himself, Templars guarding the rear, and infantry locked in tight formation around the supply train. The pace was painfully slow: 10 miles per day, then 8, then 6. An irresistible invitation for Saladin to strike. And strike he did. Before the morning haze lifted, horse archers appeared along the ridges like dark birds circling a dying animal. Their bows sang almost immediately. Arrows rained down in a relentless, whispering storm, not meant to kill quickly, but to erode resistance hour by hour. They rode close, loosed their arrows, wheeled away before the Crusaders could respond, only to return moments later. It was psychological warfare as much as physical, a war of nerves, patience, and suffering. Richard's response was almost unnatural. He ordered the knights to stay mounted, stay silent, stay still. No charges, no heroics, no answering the insults shouted from the hills. The only moment that mattered would come later, and the price of reaching it was immeasurable. By the second day, the suffering intensified. Men marched under temperatures soaring past 45 degrees, the iron of their chainmail burning against their skin. Water grew scarce, shields grew heavier, horses stumbled and collapsed. The sky darkened beneath the sheer volume of arrows, hundreds of thousands loosed each day. Witnesses described the air as alive with death, and still Richard refused to fight. Every instinct in a knight's body screamed to attack, to break formation, to make the torment stop. But the Lionheart rode along the line, reminding his men that discipline, not fury, would win them survival. Arrows cracked against shields. Men collapsed from heatstroke. Yet the formation held, unmoving, unbreaking, unbowed. Saladin watched, intrigued, then irritated, then quietly concerned. This was not the undisciplined force he had crushed at Hattin. This was a wall of steel that refused to crack. By the third and fourth days, exhaustion was reaching its peak. Infants born into war cried out their last breaths. Horses foamed at the mouth, trembling under the weight of armored riders. Crossbowmen fired from the center, each bolt a precious resource, each shot taken with absolute intent. Saladin lost hundreds of warriors to these deadly quarrels, but he welcomed the losses. His horse archers could fire forever, the crusaders could not. Time, he believed, was drowning Richard slowly. By day 5, the attacks intensified. The Templars at the rear were under constant assault, forced to ride backward in their saddles to face the enemy, presenting a shield wall of iron as their horses were led forward by squires. It was humiliating for the proudest knights of Christendom, and yet strategically flawless. The tension in the Crusader ranks tightened like a bowstring drawn to its limit. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, and everything would collapse. Some knights did break. Their patience snapped, and they charged blindly into the swirling horse archers, only to be surrounded and cut down. Their dying screams drifted back to the column, a chilling reminder of what awaited anyone who broke formation. By the 6th day, discipline hung by a thread. The Hospitallers, who had borne the brunt of the attacks for nearly a week, were on the verge of collapse. Many had lost their horses. Many marched with arrows jutting from their shields and armor. The order's master, Garnier de Nablus, made his frustration clear. His men could not endure much more. But Richard stood firm. Speeding the march would only embolden Saladin. A premature counterattack would be suicide. The English king needed Saladin to commit everything, and commit blindly. That night, as darkness fell over the plains and the moans of the wounded mingled with the distant rhythm of Muslim war drums, Richard's officers gathered around him. The enemy would attack with full force the following morning. They all knew it. They also knew that the army was at its limit. The question hanging in the air was unspoken but unmistakable. Could they survive another day? Richard's answer was a simple, icy command. Hold the line. When he commits, we strike. This was the moment historians still argue about. Was everything, every mile slowed, every arrow endured, every scream ignored, part of Richard's plan? Did he truly foresee that by letting his army suffer, he could pull Saladin into the one position where the Sultan could be destroyed? Or was it desperation transformed into brilliance by circumstance? Whatever the truth, the 7th day arrived. And as dawn broke on September 7th, Saladin assembled the full might of his empire, 30,000 men, ready to crush the Crusader column before it reached the fortified camp at Arsuf. The hills moved with cavalry. The valley shimmered with drawn sabers. Drums thundered like the heartbeat of a giant. The final blow was coming. The Crusaders had survived 7 days of hell. Now the real battle was about to begin. At dawn on September 7th, 1191, the plains near Arsuf were cloaked in a golden haze. The Mediterranean shimmered to the west, calm and indifferent. But inland, dust clouds rose in dark, roiling waves as tens of thousands of riders gathered in formation. This was no longer the scattered harassment of the past week. This was a mobilization of the full might of Saladin's empire, the largest force he had committed since Hattin. 30,000 warriors, hardened by decades of conflict, advanced toward a Crusader army that had been pushed to the brink of collapse. For 7 days, Saladin had probed, harassed, tested, and tormented Richard's forces. Now he believed the moment had finally come. The Crusaders were within sight of the fortified camp at Arsuf. If they reached it, they would be safe. If they were broken before then, they would be annihilated. Saladin sensed vulnerability, an exhaustion so deep it must surely precede disaster. More importantly, he sensed inevitability. After all, no army could endure such punishment and still fight with strength. He was right about the suffering, but he was disastrously wrong about the Crusaders. The Muslim assault began at mid-morning, first with a storm of arrows so dense they darkened the sun, then with thunderous charges of Mamluk cavalry slashing in toward the rear. The drums pounded relentlessly, their deep, chest-shaking rhythm designed to unnerve even the boldest warriors. The Templars, guarding the rear, took the worst of it. Men recoiled from the impacts of arrows. Horses screamed as they collapsed onto the sand. Shields rattled endlessly as volleys struck with punishing force. And then Saladin unleashed something more personal. Taqi al-Din, his nephew, a fierce and seasoned commander, led a powerful charge directly at the Hospitaller banner in the Crusader vanguard. It was a calculated insult, a direct challenge meant to break the last shreds of Hospitaller discipline. After 7 days of suffering, 7 days of watching comrades die without retaliation, the provocation was too much to bear. Master Garnier de Nablus, unable to watch his brothers be cut down any longer, made the decision that would ignite the greatest crisis of Richard's campaign. He lowered his lance, spurred his massive warhorse forward, and charged. The Hospitallers followed. 300 knights, their tempers frayed to breaking, erupted from the formation like arrows launched from a giant bow. Dust exploded beneath their hooves as they hurtled toward the enemy. It was a spectacular charge, impassioned, furious, heroic. It was also reckless. If allowed to continue on its own, it would be suicidal. For a split second, the future of the Third Crusade hung in absolute uncertainty. Richard saw the break. He saw the danger. He understood instantly that he had two choices: sound the recall and watch the Hospitallers be encircled and slaughtered, or commit everything, every knight, every horse, into a full, uncontrolled counterattack. The decision had to be made in the span of a heartbeat. He chose to unleash hell. Richard raised his sword. The trumpets blasted 3 long, piercing notes, notes that every crusader had been praying to hear for 7 agonizing days, and the world changed. 2,000 knights surged forward at once, not in a chaotic rush, but in a controlled, tightly aligned formation. The Hospitallers formed the right wing of the charge. The Templars anchored the left, and Richard himself led the center, a wedge of English, Norman, and French knights who formed the steel core of the entire army. The charge accelerated, 11 miles per hour, 20, 30. War horses, bred for a single purpose, to shatter lines of men, hammered the ground with devastating force. The thunder of their hooves drowned out the drums. The wind screamed past their helmets. In moments, they transformed from a marching army into a hurtling wall of iron and fury. Muslim horse archers, stunned, found themselves unable to retreat quickly enough. For 7 days, they had tormented the Crusaders with deadly impunity. Now, with terrifying suddenness, the roles reversed. The hunters became the hunted. The impact was not merely violent, it was elemental. A charging knight with a 12-foot lance generates the kinetic energy of a modern vehicle collision. Multiply that by 2,000, and the result is catastrophic. The first lines of Muslim cavalry didn't break. They disintegrated. Lances splintered into clouds of wooden shards. Bodies were flung backward. Horses toppled. The very ground trembled. Yet the most astonishing part came after the first collision. The knights did not slow. As their lances shattered, they drew swords, maces, and axes. Their war horses plowed onward, kicking, biting, trampling. The Crusader line remained cohesive, tight, unstoppable. A single giant beast with iron skin and a heart full of wrath. Richard's wedge punched directly into the Mamluk center. Eyewitnesses recount seeing the Lionheart himself cutting down warriors with such strength that it bordered on myth. He swung with brutal rhythm, each stroke clearing space, each movement driving the charge deeper into the enemy formation. Meanwhile, on the left, the Templars crashed into Taqi al-Din's forces with ruthless precision. Their timing was perfect. As the center collapsed, the Muslim right flank found itself exposed. Panic spread like wildfire. A retreat began, not orderly, but frantic, desperate. Horses collided, riders fell. The sound of fleeing men echoed across the field, and the Crusaders pressed harder. In just minutes, the momentum shifted irreversibly. Saladin's carefully coordinated attack unraveled into chaos. Entire squadrons fled, the weight of their fear overwhelming their years of training. Even the elite Mamluks, the pride of the Sultan's armies, broke under the ferocity of the charge. Saladin himself watched the disaster unfold from the rear, horrified. He had underestimated the psychological power of 7 days of restraint. These knights were not fighting simply to win. They were fighting to release every ounce of pain, humiliation, rage, and exhaustion they had endured. The charge was not a tactic. It was vengeance. The Sultan attempted to rally his reserves, but the sight of the elite forces routing broke their spirit. His standard, usually the immovable symbol of authority, fell as its bearers fled. Saladin barely escaped the field, dragged away by his personal guard as the Crusader onslaught tore through what remained of his center. 17 minutes. That was all it took. 17 minutes to destroy 30,000 men. 17 minutes to shatter the myth of Saladin's invincibility. 17 minutes to transform a beaten, bleeding column into the most devastating cavalry force of the medieval world. When the dust settled, the plain was carpeted with bodies, more dead than most medieval battles saw in an entire day. High-ranking emirs lay among foot soldiers, their armor crushed, their banners torn. Horses wandered riderless across the field. The Crusaders, exhilarated and breathless, wanted to pursue, to finish the victory, to annihilate the fleeing army entirely. But Richard refused. Even in the intoxicating aftermath of triumph, the Lionheart understood the cost of overreaching. His men were exhausted, their horses blown. A pursuit into unfamiliar ground could turn victory into ruin. Discipline had won the day. Recklessness could still lose the war. So he called his army back. No triumphant shouting, no chaotic chase, only order, calm, precise, unwavering. Just as it had been during the march, discipline remained the deadliest weapon Richard possessed. Within hours, reports spread across the Levant like wildfire. The Sultan's aura of invincibility, forged over years of victories, lay shattered. The Mamluks, his most trusted warriors, had been decimated, and every Muslim soldier who survived Arsuf carried with him the memory of those ironclad mountains thundering across the fields, unstoppable, unbreakable, inescapable. The Battle of Arsuf was over, but its effects were only beginning. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon on September 7, 1191, the plains of Arsuf lay silent. The heat of battle had given way to the stillness of death. Dust settled over thousands of bodies: Mamluks, Turkish archers, Bedouin cavalrymen, warriors who only hours earlier had believed themselves instruments of divine destiny. Now they formed a carpet of broken armor and crimson sand stretching as far as the eye could see. The Crusader knights, weary yet unbowed, dismounted where they stood. Many collapsed beside their horses, too exhausted to speak. Others knelt in prayer, their armored hands trembling from fatigue. For 7 days they had endured fire, thirst, and torment. For 17 minutes they had unleashed a storm the world would speak of for centuries. The field belonged to Richard the Lionheart. But victory brought no celebration, only the grim work of tending the wounded, gathering the dead, and rebuilding coherence after an ordeal that had pushed each man to the edges of human endurance. Richard walked among them, speaking softly, placing a hand on a shoulder here, a word of praise there. He understood that what had happened was not merely a tactical triumph. It was a story his men would carry with them for the rest of their lives, and it was a message that would soon echo through every corner of the Holy Land. News of the catastrophe reached Saladin that very night. The great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who had retaken Jerusalem, the man who had crushed the Crusaders at Hattin, sat in stunned silence as messengers recounted the details. His personal guard, shaken and humiliated, confirmed the unthinkable. His elite Mamluks, the core of his military engine, had been torn apart in minutes. Many of his most trusted commanders were dead. His army, though still vast, no longer possessed the unshakable confidence that had defined it. For the first time in years, whispers spread through the ranks of the Ayyubid forces, words that no one dared speak before Arsuf. Perhaps the Franks cannot be broken. In warfare, morale is often more powerful than swords or shields. The psychological shock of Arsuf was immediate and devastating. Garrisons along the coast, once confident in their ability to resist, began to reconsider their chances. Towns that might have fought to the last man now preferred negotiation over certain destruction. Soldiers who once terrifyingly harassed Crusader columns now approached them with caution, even fear. Richard's army, though battered, marched south with renewed purpose. As they approached Jaffa, the city surrendered without a fight. Its defenders had seen what had happened at Arsuf. They wanted no part of it. The coastal road to Jerusalem, the lifeline of any Crusader advance, lay open. And yet Richard, in the aftermath of his greatest victory, faced a choice more difficult than any decision on the battlefield. His generals urged him to press inland, to reclaim the Holy City, to finish what the Third Crusade had begun. Many knights believed that Jerusalem was now within their grasp. The Muslim army seemed broken, its spirit wounded. But Richard knew better. His genius was not only in the charge, nor in the patience that preceded it. It was in understanding the limits of his own strength. His army was still small, his supply lines fragile, his horses exhausted. And he understood something that few crusading leaders ever acknowledged. Conquering Jerusalem was easy compared to holding it. Without total dominance of the surrounding countryside, without secure access to water and reinforcements, the city would become a trap. Arsuf had given him momentum. It had not given him invincibility. So Richard continued his cautious advance, securing fortress after fortress, rebuilding coastal cities, and negotiating from a position of overwhelming strength. His conversations with Saladin, respectful, cunning, often conducted through trusted envoys, took on a new tone. No longer were they exchanges between predator and prey. They were conversations between warriors who understood one another, perhaps better than any two enemies in medieval history. Saladin, humbled yet not broken, shifted his strategy away from open battle. He would not again risk his forces in the kind of confrontation that had nearly cost him everything. From this point onward, the conflict became one of skirmishes, sieges, and diplomacy. No more great cavalry charges, no more sweeping battles on open plains. The legacy of Arsuf stretched far beyond the Third Crusade itself. For the Crusaders, the battle became a symbol of what disciplined heavy cavalry could achieve when wielded with precision and timing. Generations of European commanders studied Richard's tactics, marveling at the way he turned 7 days of suffering into the coiled spring of a decisive assault. Knights across the continent told stories of how their brothers at Arsuf held formation under impossible pressure, how their discipline became a weapon sharper than any blade. For the Muslim world, Arsuf became a lesson in humility. The aura of invincibility that surrounded Saladin after Hattin was forever gone. Though he remained respected, even revered, the certainty that the Franks could be manipulated and destroyed at will had evaporated. Future commanders remembered the iron storm of Arsuf, the way the Frankish charge tore through the finest cavalry of the East, as if they were dry reeds in a windstorm. For modern historians and military thinkers, Arsuf is a masterclass in operational patience. Richard demonstrated the power of endurance, the value of timing, and the deadly effectiveness of baiting an enemy into overcommitment. The formula would echo in battles for centuries: allow the enemy to exhaust themselves, then strike with concentrated force at the perfect moment. From Waterloo to Desert Storm, generals have repeated Richard's principles without even realizing it. But for Richard himself, the battle was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because no other medieval king alive could have orchestrated such a victory. Tragedy, because no commander, not even the Lionheart, could replicate such perfect conditions again. Arsuf was a singular moment in time, born from suffering, tension, and the razor-thin balance between chaos and control. Years later, when chroniclers wrote about the Crusade, they struggled to describe what happened in those 17 minutes. Some called it divine intervention. Others called it madness. But the veterans of the battle, those who survived the desert heat and the iron collision, understood the truth. It was discipline. Superhuman, agonizing, absolute discipline, combined with the courage to wait until the world held its breath. And then, to strike. As the surviving Crusaders set their camp at Arsuf, the sea breeze finally cooling their armor, they looked back toward the battlefield, a landscape where their suffering had transformed into victory. They had lost brothers, shed blood, and endured horrors no chronicle could fully capture. But they had stood firm. They had held the line. And in the moment of release, they had shattered an empire. The Third Crusade continued. Negotiations eventually brought a fragile peace. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, yet Christian pilgrims were granted access, and the coastal cities were secured. The Holy Land would endure decades of shifting power before new wars rose to reshape it again. But Arsuf remained. Because in the history of medieval warfare, no battle demonstrates so clearly how discipline can overcome desperation, how planning can transform suffering into strength, and how the fate of nations can hinge not on numbers or brute force, but on 17 minutes that echo across the centuries.